So it was pointed out at the end of the last session that our presenters were not able to respond to the critiques of their message. They were both invited. If they so desired, they did decline. We will not have that as our format, mainly due as a issue of time. So we'll have 3 20-minute presentations. It'll be followed by about 5 minutes of response. So if you're one of the presenters that's been part of the weekend with us, you are eligible to make a response, but 5 minutes is not going to allow for very many or very long. Okay, so this is Frank Hardy, and he will be presenting the first of 3 segments on the papacy atheism position.
Dear kind Heavenly Father, we've had many prayers today, but I also lift my voice. I need you. I ask for your spirit and wisdom and for your presence in this presentation in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, understanding Daniel 11:40-45, and my sincere apology to those of you who are not scholars. Some of this is going to be on a technical level, and we're going to have to fly. Okay. I'm going to, if you haven't read my web paper, the focused study of the last 6 verses, please read it. I will not be reading it to you this afternoon. Instead, I'm going to focus on 16-28 and 29-39. So it's kind of the complement of the topic. But with one eye off stage, we're going to be focusing on the principles in the last 6 verses. But this is what we have. Back in Daniel 2, the question is, are progressions part of Daniel's thought world? Or is it the case that where we start is where we have to end? And I'm going to argue that progressions are very much a part of Daniel's worldview or thought world. In Daniel 2, it's not just 4 metals and then a rock. That's not it. It's metal, metal, metal plus metal. See, gold is an element, silver is an element, brass is not. That's usually copper and tin. And then iron with clay. Clay has nothing to do with iron. And then a non-metal. So it's metal, metal with metal, metal with non-metal, and then just non-metal by itself. That is a progression. And the iron mixed with clay is a transitional category, leading us gradually to the kingdom of God. We start with the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar. We end with the kingdom of God. And the Lord is leading us by gradual stages. In Daniel 7, the progression is not on this level. It's just numeric. 2 wings, 2 sides, 3 ribs, 4 heads, 4 wings, 7 heads, 10 horns. Increasing numbers. And we could just say that's interesting. But now these are progressions within chapters. If we start looking at progressions across chapters, there's a very interesting one. We start with metals, which are totally inanimate. And then we go to wild animals that are destructive. And then domesticated animals that are used in worship. And then to people who are themselves capable of worship. So this is another progression. And both of these apply, all of what I've said applies. The first 2 parts of what I said apply to the prophecy itself. The progression is within the prophecy. And so therefore, it would also apply within the interpretation. So it's not just a matter of symbolic prophecy, literal interpretation, but there's a progression within the prophecy. And if you explain what you just prophesied, that progression is within the explanation as well. Okay, just a moment. Let me run that one back. Okay. In this context, Daniel 10 through 12 should be the most spiritual of the 4 main prophecies. Not to miss that point. Okay. Now, here what I'm doing is looking at the world empires. I'm counting verses because I'm trying to tease out how much time and attention the angel gives to a given empire within, in this case, a given chapter, without reference to what he says about the empire, just how much time does he spend on it. And so this is what we have if we combine Daniel 8 and Daniel 9 together. This is what we get if we don't. It does matter how we group these chapters. 8 and 9 have to go together, or you don't get these symmetries. You don't get that, you get this. And then the next thing up is 10 through 12. Now, this is just 10 through 12 all by itself, and you get the same type of progression. This functions like a parallel prophecy. It does not function like an explanation just tacked on. And then when you combine all of these together, you get this progression. Okay, so Daniel 8 and 9 must be joined as one. Daniel 10 through 12 must be joined as one. Daniel 8 to 9 and 10 to 12 are parallel prophecies. And you'll notice I've been talking about progressions. You start out with the prophecy lasting one chapter, that's Daniel 2, then one chapter, that's Daniel 7, then 8 and 9, that's 2 chapters, then 10 through 12, that's 3 chapters. There's another progression hardwired into the structure of the book. Okay, now we'll look at Daniel 10 through 12. And here's a broad outline. 10 and 12 frame Daniel 11 between them. We could call that an outer inclusio. There's also an inner inclusio, and this is the first part of 11:2 and then 12:4. And at the center of that structure, we have 16 through 28, and this is what I want to concentrate on next. In my view, these 3 main sections of Daniel 11 deal with 3 empires. The third, the fourth, I'm going to say 4A and 4B. And I'm going to use coded language because I don't want this talk to descend to the level of interpretation. I don't want to interpret for you. The one thing interpretation that I will reserve the right to present is that Christ is at the center of this chapter. Apart from that, I don't want to interpret. This is just structural markers. Okay, Daniel 10. In Daniel 10, we said this was supposed to be a spiritual prophecy. Well, it is. Notice in the left column, behold a man clothed in linen with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist, and so on. In the opposite column, on the right, we had the parallel description from Revelation chapter 1, and we know who that was. It was a description of Christ, the glorified Christ. Well, this is the pre-existent Christ in the left column. Opposite 14a, there's no entry there. Daniel 10 says nothing about Christ's hair. And in opposite 6b, there's nothing about his face. But the rest tracks in parallel, and for the most part, in the same sequence. Opposite 6b, you'll notice the asterisk, and then an asterisk across from 16c. So those are parallel descriptions. This is a vision of Christ, which would be replicated later in Revelation. Here is an overview of the structure of Daniel 11 from my point of view. And again, we will be focusing on that middle section. Prince of the Covenant. Now, there are 2 series of verbal parallels that intersect in 11:16. So there's one coming from Daniel 8, and there's another coming from Daniel 9, and they cross at 11:16. So here they are. He did as he pleased and became great. Then a mighty king will appear who will rule with great power and do as he pleases, and do as he pleases, and do as he pleases. That's one series of parallels, and I've lightly highlighted 11:16. Now here's the second series. This is Haba Elav, means the one who comes. Nagid Haba means the prince who comes. So the one who comes, the prince who comes. And then I'm going to skip on down. You'll have to take my word that those are closely parallel, and I'm going to go to the next slide. In 11:16, we have the one who comes. In 9:26, we have the prince who comes. And then in 8:9, we have another expression also using a verb of coming. And this is the little horn. When the little horn appears, it says, out of one of them came a little horn. This is the prince who comes. And it's the one who comes in Daniel 11. And it's one these are the two streams of parallels that intersect at Daniel 11:16. 11:16 is a turning point in the chapter. Now, I want to talk about the verses that follow that. There are 13 verses, 6 on each side, and then the verse in the middle. Now, this is a list of the initial predicates in the verses in the section. And we're not going to spend any time on this, but just notice that in the first group, there are 4 entries, and in the second group, there are 2, and then 1 and 2 and 4. And so here we have that. Then I want to go to the next slide. These are the verses, 16 to 19, 20 to 21, 22, 20, and so on. 4, 2, 1, 2, 4. So just notice the symmetry. Now, that is predicated on these initial words, the first word in each verse. And now we can add to that in the same groups of verses, 4, 2, 1, 2, 4, the theme of violence. Violence is present in the first 4 verses. It is absent in the next 2. It's present in the middle verse, absent, present. 4, 2, 1, 2, 4, and plus, minus, plus, minus, plus, violence. Those 2 things correspond. And now we'll go to the next slide. And at the center of all of this is the Prince of the Covenant. Now, that centrality of the Prince is highlighted by this. You have Bashalva, a Hebrew word that means in peace or by stealth or whatever, anyway, not violent, in verse 21. And when you place the verse number at the beginning of verse 24 in the correct place, this word is also in verse 23. So it's 21 and 23. Now, in Hebrew copies of the Old Testament, that verse number is misplaced. And I'm not making this up. If you go to the critical apparatus, the editors acknowledge the problem. And they say this makes bad syntax, it makes a problem, and there are 2 ways we can solve it. So Biblia Hebraica Shukartensia says, keep the verse number where it is and change a letter of the text. What madman, ready for the insane asylum, would change a letter of the text in order to keep a verse number there? Well, Kittle got it right. Back in the 1930s, he said, keep the text, move the verse number, but still it's misplaced. Well, when you get it right, these words frame the reference to Christ at the center of this section. And it's not just that there's a frame, it's that it's this frame, that in peace, and then the violence done to Christ at the center of the chapter. In this section, there are a couple of framing statements, glorious land and holy covenant. I just think, my sense is that these have the same flavor. I think they correspond to each other. They're both evocative, they're both spiritual terms. And yes, glorious land means Judea, but it refers in a spiritual way to Judea. You can't take God out of the promised land because he's the one giving the promise. Okay, so wars, we will just have to, I don't know what to include. I think we'll just quit there. I don't know what to do. We're within the 5-minute section. If I had to summarize this lecture in one word, I would say Christ. If I had to summarize it in 2 words, I would say Christ crucified. And in my concept of the structure of Daniel 11, the whole thing, from the framing of the middle chapter to that inner inclusio, to the fact that there are 3 sections, to the structure of this inner section, all of that is a conspiracy casting a flood of attention and emphasis on Christ. And there is more to say, but we will stop there.
Thank you, Brother Frank. All right, we do have just a few more minutes if anyone from the group would like to respond to Frank's presentation. So we're not going to do this with the other 2, but he's chosen to summarize and leave us with just a minute or two. Is there anybody from any of the other groups that wants to say anything? All right, Jim, come on up. All right, we've had good collegial dialogue. Let's keep that going here. We only have a few minutes to do this, so have to be very brief.
Ken, thank you very much for your presentation. Much of it was over my head, but I did appreciate what you were doing because I did read your entire paper. While I agree that Christ is the object of these prophecies, particularly 11, it is that is not meant to be. The prophecies are focusing on Christ, every action of Christ. Christ becomes an object by the events leading to the presence of Christ and the crucifixion of Christ. And it is that history that drove Pentecost for almost 300 years until Porphyry says we've got to put a stop to this movement by discrediting Daniel as a predictor of history. That same history that led up to the appearance of Christ and his teachings and death and resurrection and so on. And that is the power of the prophecy. And so just at the second coming, Christ is object, but it's the events in history that will point men to the coming of Christ that is the power behind the latter rain.
All right. Frank, would you like to respond to that? Thank you, Jim.
I didn't get to talk about that history.
All right.
I just appreciate the presentation. I've sometimes heard it said that there's no vision connected with Daniel 11, and I think the vision of Daniel 10, which I also connect with Revelation 1, does show us the focus and the centrality of Christ at the cross and also his later ministry in the sanctuary on humanity's behalf, and I affirm that and appreciate that.
Thank you. And we also have 1137, the one desired by women, and then in chapter 12, it's the man clothed in linen, the vision of Christ. It's that being that narrates chapter 12. So we get it in 10, we get it in 12, we get it at the center of 11. There's a lot of emphasis here.
Thanks. And Frank, you've done really wonderful, detailed work. And this is only a tiny bit of it. He's frustrated because he can't present all of it, but I've seen a great deal more, and I'm very impressed. And there are many wonderful, beautiful patterns that you're showing, including with Christ, the ones you showed, the chiasm and so on. And in literature, you can have multiple layers of patterns, depending upon what you're looking for. And these don't necessarily identify for you what the historical reference are, but they do indicate something of theological significance, and that Christ is really important here. Of course, in Daniel 11, I mean, obviously I take a more literal view than you do of the rest of the chapter, but in the rest of the chapter, God's people are being, held under. They come out, you see them. They're persecuted and so on. And then at the end, hurrah, Michael stands up and they're resurrected. And so the whole chapter is all about Christ. Whichever of these interpretations one would take, it's all about him. So as far as the disjunction there, the sections, verse 16, beginning of section and so on, I'll be addressing that a little bit more later. But I just wanted to affirm that the centrality of Christ, although I'm not seeing that it has to be symbolic in the latter chapter to be Christological, and I'll address that as well, so I won't take time.
Okay, thank you, Dr.
Good, thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Frank, do you want to say anything as a closing comment?
Well, just to clarify that symbolic is not the same thing as spiritual. What I'm arguing for is spiritual, with or without symbols.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. We appreciate the presentation. Okay, Norman, if you are ready. Oh, Marc's going next. All right. Marc Swearigan-Bates will be presenting the next in the Papacy Atheism View. Marc, you have 20 minutes.
Just the green? Okay. Okay. Good afternoon. Happy Sabbath to you. Thank you. Well, my name is Pastor Marcus Swearigan-Bates, and I'm coming here from Knoxville, Tennessee, where I'm the senior pastor of the Knoxville First Seventh-day Adventist Church. And one of my dear brothers, Brother Randy's here today, and so it's good to have a church member here. I think he's here to check up on me and make sure that we're doing okay. But I'm here to present some thoughts on the papacy atheism view. And let me just say up front that I think we need to be careful about being dogmatic, and I've tried to have the idea that I want to be open to different views, and I can just say that I've learned so much about other views different than my own, and I've gained a deeper understanding just by dialoguing and hearing presentations and having conversations, and it's just been a great experience for me. And I just want you to know that as I present today, this is what is resonating with me personally as far as an understanding of Daniel 11. And I don't claim infallibility. I'm not saying that all the positions that I present are unassailable, and I think they're open to critique and discussion. And I'm hoping that this seminar will begin a healthy dialogue on this prophecy. So I'm going to present some thoughts on Daniel 11 and the King of the South. And this is going to be just a brief survey through the chapter, talking about the kings of the north and the south. And Dr. McNulty, who will come after me, will unpack some of these things a little bit more in his presentation. The first thing that I'd like to just observe that resonates with me is I personally believe that the four major apocalyptic visions of Daniel survey the same basic history. The principal empires of Daniel's visions are surveyed and repeated, and as Dr. Vine brought out, expanded somewhat as each vision progresses. And as you see the column there describing Daniel 10, 11, and 12 as a single apocalypse, you see this framework through the textual evidence, I believe, of Persia, Greece, the four Greek empires, imperial Rome, papal Rome, and then the judgment and the second advent. And I think that Daniel 11 talks about these principal kingdoms. Now, I also want to say that as I understand Daniel 11, again, this is just my view, this is what resonates with me, I see the chapter broken up into the following sections. I see Daniel 11, 1, 2, 3, and 4 discussing Persia, discussing Greece, and specifically Alexander the Great, and then the four Greek empires that came as the result of the breakup of Alexander's kingdom shortly after his death. Then when you go into verses 5 to 15, you see an expansion, a repetition and expansion of these four Greek empires through a specific discussion of two of them. And the reason why I believe that these two empires are discussed is because in the Hellenistic era, which is the interim between the death of Alexander and the rise of Rome, you see a battle between these generals to control Alexander's empire, but you see also a specific set of conflicts between the king of the north, which at that point in the narrative, at that time in history, consisted of the Seleucid Empire, north of geographic Israel, and then the Ptolemaic dynasty, which was located geographically south of Israel, and how those two powers fought not only with each other, but God's covenant people who were located in that region were caught in the middle of these battles and these wars, these conflicts. And so I see verses 5 to 15 describing this battle between Syria, the king of the north at that point in the narrative, and Egypt, the king of the south. Now, I'm of the opinion that when we see the power that comes against him and does according to his will in verse 16, I believe that's a transition into Rome. And I believe that Rome is the power that came against Syria. It conquered Syria militarily, and then I believe personally this power assumed the role of the next king of the north in the prophecy. Now, let me just say something about geography versus symbolism and spiritual context. I think that while there are some geographical elements in this prophecy, and I'm going to argue that they go up to verse 29, I do believe that we also have to look at the spiritual posture and disposition of what these directions symbolize in relationship to how these powers related to God and his covenant people. And when you look at the Syrian dynasty and their posture toward God and toward God's people, they were oppressive. They, in a sense, sat in the place of God. They controlled God's covenant people. They restricted conscience, and they persecuted them. And I think that those are important qualities with respect to the symbolism of the direction of the north. Because the reality is that God is the true king of the north, as Pastor Myers brought out in his message earlier. And any power, beginning with Satan in Isaiah 14, any power that tries to sit in God's position and assume God's prerogatives is a counterfeit king of the north. And even though these powers are predominantly geographic through a good portion of this vision, I think it's important to identify the spiritual posture toward God and his covenant people as represented by these directions. And of course, Rome, when it came on the scene, exercised the same posture toward God's covenant people. And I see Rome being in verses 16 to the first part of 30, where Rome is grieved in verse 30, but then it returns. And I personally see that as a return of Rome. After having collapsed in its imperial pagan phase, it returns then in its papal phase. And so in the second part of verse 30b, you might say, we see the power that emerges called the papacy that then has indignation against the Holy Covenant. And I personally believe that this power then becomes the next king of the north in the prophecy, not necessarily because it absorbed paganism and took the place of imperial Rome, but specifically because of its posture toward God and God's covenant people. It sat in the place of God. It persecuted God's people. It spake great words against the Most High and exalted itself to the Prince of the host, etc. And so this then, I believe, becomes the next king of the north. And I see verse 30b through to verse 39 as a description of the Dark Age papacy from 538 to 1798. Then when we move into verse 40, we have the phrase, at the time of the end. And my personal opinion is that the time of the end began in 1798, according to Daniel 12, verses 4 through 9, and according to Great Controversy 356. And there are many evidences that we could extract from the pioneer writings that would suggest that the time of the end began in the year 1798 and progresses through to the second advent of Christ. And I personally see verse 40 and the phrase, at the time of the end. I think that preposition at is very important. In my opinion, it suggests a specific point in time. And I see this verse as describing the deadly wound of the papacy by the king of the south. And I'm going to talk about the king of the south in a few moments. And then in the second part of verse 40, we see the beginning of the healing of this wound. And as this power comes back to dominance, we see in verses 41 to 45 its desire to exercise global control, as we see in Revelation 13. Okay? Then, of course, when we span down to Daniel 12, 1, 2, and 3, as Pastor Myers talked about, close of probation, second advent, and then those that shine as the brightness of the stars will reign for eternity. So this is my personal understanding of how Daniel 11 is arranged in terms of empire sequences. Okay? All right, now let's get into some specifics. And again, I'm just going to survey through this, some summary points since our time is limited. And again, Dr. McNulty will unpack some more specific points on this. Let's look at some summary points. Again, as the chart a few slides ago showed, I believe that Daniel 10, 11, and 12 is sequentially consistent with Daniel's earlier apocalyptic visions. The final power in Daniel 2, I believe, the feet of iron and clay. The little horn in Daniel 7, the little horn in Daniel 8, those are all descriptive of Rome in its papal phase. And 11 Bible commentary, I believe it's 1168 and 1169, talks about how the mingling of churchcraft and statecraft is outlined by the feet of iron and clay. I personally see that as a description of the papacy in Daniel 2. So my point is we see this consistent pattern of the papacy being the final power. And when I say there in parentheses, the original pioneer view, I want to qualify that by affirming the presentation we heard. The first presentation during Sabbath school today, I forget the gentleman's name, but he talked about how prior to 1871, when Uriah Smith brought out the view of the Eastern question, our pioneers really didn't have a settled position on Daniel 11. However, I do believe that both James White and Uriah Smith did see the papacy as the final power in Daniel 11. They still saw a geographic move to the Middle East with that power, but they still held that the power was Rome in terms of the final power in Daniel 11. Now, I want to present to you an opinion. This is my personal view. geographic literalism is not required throughout the entire narrative of Daniel 11. I do not believe, I know I've been hearing a lot about how it has to be literal all the way through. My personal view is that I think that once the papacy enters the narrative, I think we begin the transition to a broader power, and we need to be looking beyond geography simply because the book of Revelation describes a more global spiritual conflict at the end of time. And I think we get into a dangerous area if we restrict conflicts to just geographic regions. That's my personal view. And so I don't necessarily agree with the presupposition that geographic literalism is required. Again, end-time prophecy is global in scope and not limited to geography. And I hear an awful lot of talk about Alexander's former empire and how those kings have to be in those regions. Alexander's empire ceased to exist in 30 BC when Octavian conquered the last remaining Hellenistic empire of Ptolemaic Egypt. So that empire is done and has ceased to exist since that day. So to go back there, in my mind, at least from my way of thinking, it doesn't jive. And I say that with great respect to all the positions that are presented. I don't mean to be condescending or demean anybody's position. I'm just saying it, in my mind, it doesn't make sense to go back to that empire. And again, I believe the entrance of papal Rome into Daniel 11, into the narrative in verses 30 and 31, signifies the beginning of a shift where we're getting broader in the influence of these kingdoms. They're not just restricted to geography or geographic in terms of placement, but they're exerting a more global influence. Okay, and again, when it comes to these directions of the north and the south, we have to focus on the posture of these powers toward God and toward his covenant people. And the papacy, in terms of its posture toward God, wants to be God. It wants to sit in the place of God. It wants to exercise God's prerogatives. And its posture toward God's people is this: if you don't comply with us, we will persecute you. And so I think that's an important understanding when it comes to the direction of the north. Now, here's an observation too, and again, I'm saying this with a little bit of elbow room. I think that it's very interesting that when you look at the personal pronouns in Daniel 11, what's interesting is from verses 1 to 29, when personal pronouns are used, they apply both to a kingdom and the activities of a specific ruler within that kingdom on a regular scale. In verses 5 to 15, you see the mention of many Antiochian Seleucid kings and many Ptolemaic kings that represent their empires and also describe individual activities within the reigns of those empires. Whereas when you get to verse 30, you seem to see a move away from that to where the pronouns simply just represent the empires. And as was presented in Sabbath school with Kim's presentation, I see the point that the argument could be made that in verse 40 you see Napoleon as a king, you see Pope Pius VI as a king, and that's something to think about. Even so, I still see this shift, and I think that's an important detail that confirms that we're seeing a shift into a broader scope of activity that is not just limited to a geographic region in Daniel 11. Now, again, verses 5 to 15, the king of the north is Seleucid Syria in this text, in this passage, and the king of the south is Ptolemaic Egypt. And then in Daniel 11, 16 to 22, we find a shift into pagan imperial Rome. And in verse 16, you find someone who comes against the Seleucid dynasty and does according to his will, and then eventually will stand in the glorious land and consume that land, which I believe began with the activities of Pompey, who entered that region of the world in 64, ended the Seleucid dynasty, and then eventually subjugated Judea by 63, conquering Jerusalem, capturing Jerusalem. And then, you go through those verses, and you see in verse 20 the raiser of taxes, which is Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor. And then, as Dr. Hardy brought out and others brought out, in verse 22, you see the breaking of the Prince of the Covenant. And I think those are markers in the vision, markers in the prophecy that show us where we're at in the stream of history through the narrative. So I see imperial Rome there. And because imperial Rome, pagan Rome, if you will, exercised a strong posture toward God's covenant people, which consisted of Israel in that day, geographic Israel, they become the next king of the north in the vision Now, here's where we get a little sticky, and verses 23 to 29 is a debated phrase. It's a problematic passage for Daniel 11 interpreters. My personal view is when you look at Daniel 11, 23, and 24, I stick to Uriah Smith's understanding of this simply because in the beginning of verse 23 it says that after the alliance made, he will basically strengthen his control over a small people, or some have suggested they'll rise with a small people. Just 5 minutes? Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Well, I'll tell you what. Let me fast forward. For some reason, I thought I had a little more time, but I guess not. 5 minutes. Okay. Well, let me just say this. I'm of the opinion that there's a mention of a time at the end of verse 24, which I personally believe is a 360-year period. And I believe that 25 to 29 gives us the starting and ending points of that period, starting when Octavian conquered Marc Antony in 31 BC. And if you go 360 years, that takes you to the dedication of Constantinople in verse 29. And let me just say that was a monumental historical transition, because when Constantine shifted the imperial capital to the east, that helped to hasten the demise of old Rome in the west, and thus prepared the rise for the papacy to step into that vacuum when Rome fell, and the papacy jumps in the narrative in verse 30. So I think that fits chronologically, personally. Now again, Daniel 11, 30 to 35 describes the rise and persecuting activities of the Dark Age papacy. Okay. Oop, I'm using the laser here. And I'm in agreement with my brethren who are papacy atheist brethren that Daniel 11, 36 to 39 describes the blasphemous character of the papacy. I believe that there are strong textual connections with, he shall exalt himself, he'll speak marvelous words against the Most High. Those are textual connections with the little horns of Daniel 7 and 8. Not to mention the fact that Ellen White mentioned in Manuscript Releases, Volume 13, page 394, that verses 30 to 36 are a single unit and describe the same power. And I see that to be an inspired statement. And then, of course, there's an article in Ministry Magazine in March of 1954 where some of our church leaders got together and they discussed this passage, and they made a determination that they felt it fit better with the Dark Age papacy as opposed to atheistic France. All right, now, we talked about the phrase according to his will. How much time do I have? Like 1 minute? 3 minutes. Okay, wow. Is that prophetic time? Do I get a few more? No? All right. All right, now, here's another point of contention. Verse 40. Is it a triangular war or is it a dual war? Personally, I'm of the view that it's a dual war because I personally see the king of verse 36 as the papal king of the north. And so in verse 40, when the king of the south pushes at him, that him is the king from verse 36, which is the papacy, which is the king of the north. And I see a possible chiastic structure here, okay? All right, so let me just do this. You see the king of the south pushes, which, by the way, is deadly wound terminology, I think, with that word nagak. Pushes at him, which is the king of verse 36, the papal king of the north. Then you see the response of the king of the north coming against him in a counterattack, and that second him is the king of the south. So this is, again, just my gleaning on this. I see a chiasm that describes both of these powers in a dual war. And in my way of thinking, if the two prior north-south conflicts in Daniel 11 only involve north and south, to me it would make sense that the third one would also. Okay? All right. Again, the time of the end is the period of human history from 1798 on. The phrase "at the time of the end" seems to point to the year 1798. And I got 1 minute. All right, so Egypt. My view on the king of the south in verse 40 is I still believe that it symbolizes Egypt. Yet, because there's no evidence to suggest that it transfers to another power other than Egypt, the question is it geographic Egypt, or is it what I might call apocalyptic Egypt? All right? Since the papacy is an apocalyptic spiritual power that exerts its influence, it makes sense that the king of the south as Egypt would be the symbolism of what Egypt represents. And again, looking at the South's posture toward God and his covenant people, when you look at Pharaoh of old in Exodus chapter 5, you read Ellen White's statement in Great Controversy 269, and again, as Brother Conrad said, Daniel and Revelation fit together. If a symbol means something in one, it's got to mean the same in the other. I believe this is a symbol of atheism. Because Pharaoh of old, even though he wasn't a strict atheist, he exercised defiance and rebellion and resistance and refused to acknowledge God and his priorities. So, in essence, I'll just get this in. King of the North assumes God's prerogatives and claims to take the place of God. That's the posture of the direction of the North. The posture of the direction of the South, not even interested. Doesn't care about God, defiant, snubs his nose at him. I refuse to acknowledge your authority. And let's face it, an atheistic power in 1798, Napoleonic France, removed the papacy, and the wound has been healing from that. And let me just say one last thing. I believe since that time, this ideological, symbolic kingdom of the South, atheism, basically consists of anyone who resists and defies God's authority. And I believe that group will be conquered when the mark of the beast is enforced and when Satan counterfeits the advent of Christ, because there won't be one atheist left when that happens.
Thank you, Brother Marc.
Yes, sorry for
Probation is ended. Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, Michael stood up, I guess.
All right. Norman McNulty will take us on the last 20-minute segment. We are including 3 in this segment. This is the predominant view in our church right now. That doesn't make it more legitimate than the others. That's why we're having this conference. But there will be no questions or responses in this hour. We may start the second hour after Norman's done. We'll take a few minutes break.
Thank you. I'm going to start with a word of prayer, and we're going to get right into our presentation for this afternoon. Father in heaven, I just pray that you would guide my mind as I speak. May what is presented be clear, and I humbly ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. I'm going to be speaking about what I believe is an interpretive roadmap that Ellen White offers for us from Daniel chapter 11. Pastor Bates just made mention of it, and I'm going to jump right in. This is from 13 Manuscript Release 394. This statement says, "We have no time to lose. Troublous times are before us. The world is stirred with the spirit of war. Soon the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place." Now notice this. The prophecy in the 11th of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. So when I see that, I want to know, where are we in the prophecy? Ellen White continues and says, "Much of the history that has taken place in fulfillment of this prophecy will be repeated." Now she starts quoting in verse 30. She says, "In the 30th verse, a power is spoken of that shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant." She continues to quote all the way through verse 36. And when we read through verse 36, we have the familiar elements where arm stands on his part. They take away the daily, place the abomination that maketh desolate. By the time we get to verse 33, we see persecution. By the time we get to verse 35, we see this persecution continues until the time of the end. And then we're continuing to talk about the same power according to this statement in verse 36 about this king that does according to his will. He exalts himself and magnifies himself above every god. He speaks marvelous things against the God of gods. Interestingly, Daniel chapter 7, 4 separate times the little horn is described as having a mouth speaking great things. And in Daniel 8, it talks about how he exalts himself to the prince of the host. We see very similar language to the papacy here. So Ellen White quotes all the way through verse 36 and has said, much of the history that has taken place in fulfillment of this prophecy will be repeated. The very next thing she says then is, scenes similar to those described in these words will take place. So when we talk about what Ellen White says about Daniel 11, we all have to admit it's not a lot, but this one statement that we have is very significant because she quotes Daniel 11 starting in verse 30, goes all the way through verse 36. She says it's nearly reached its complete fulfillment, but there's history within it that will be repeated, and that leads me to believe that we can find a pattern from the history of the last part of verse 30 through verse 36 that will be repeated in the unfulfilled portion of the prophecy. And the power that is spoken of that's introduced in the last part of verse 30 is the papacy, as we see the persecuting papal power. So now we're going to move forward and see the key elements In Daniel 11, starting in verse 31, here we see arms shall stand on his part. This is a military power standing on the part of the king of the north. We've heard about this briefly. Clovis, the king of the Franks, makes an agreement with the papacy in 508 to provide military support. Then we see there's this abomination of desolation, which is a union of church and state. There's a decree from Justinian in 533 that declares the Roman bishop to be the head of all the churches. That decree is made effective in 538 when Belisarius drives out the remaining Ostrogoths. Then we see the persecution of the saints. They're persecuted by the flame, the sword, spoil, and so that's part of the pattern that we see. And we see that this persecution continues until the time of the end, which we've talked about. And then when we jump ahead to verse 40, because I believe that you see a continuation of the papacy in verses 36, 37, 38, and 39, where he's speaking marvelous things against the God of gods. This is an uninterrupted power from the last part of verse 30 all the way through verse 39. But in verse 40, that power is interrupted by the deadly wound at the time of the end. So this is a pattern that I see. Military power assisting the papacy, abomination of desolation, union of church and state, leading to the persecution of the saints, and then the papacy coming to his end. So here's the pattern that I would expect to see in the unfulfilled portion of the prophecy of Daniel 11. There's going to be a military force of state that will assist the papacy because the papacy doesn't have its own military strength to enforce its dogma. Then we're going to see union of church and state formed when it has the force of the state backing it up. That will be followed by the persecution of the saints, and then the king of the north will come to its end. Now, I'm going to talk briefly about some key elements here as we set up 40 to 45. In verse 40, the very beginning, it says, "At the time of the end, the king of the south shall push at him." Ellen White makes the succinct statement in Bible Commentary, Volume 7, page 971, that the books of Daniel and the Revelation are one. This is interesting. Great Controversy in 356 shows that the 1260 years ended in 1798, and we have multiple examples in Scripture, in Daniel and Revelation, describing the 1260 years. Daniel 7:25 says that the saints of the Most High will be worn out for the time, and the dividing of time. We see that they're persecuted for many days in Daniel 11:33 to 35 until the time of the end. And then we see in 12:7 that the holy people would be scattered until the time of the end. Then we see the 1260 in chapter 11 leading up to the French Revolution. We see it again in chapter 12 during the chapter on the Great Controversy. We see it again in chapter 13 describing the rise of the papal beast that has a mouth speaking great things and rules for 42 months. When you see a prophecy repeated that many times, you know it's significant. So I would expect to see it in Daniel chapter 11. We see in Daniel 11:40, I believe, very clearly the deadly wound. Revelation 13:3, the same thing. The books of Daniel and the Revelation are one. We interpret them together. They follow very similar principles of interpretation. Now, as far as dealing with the King of the South, as Seventh-day Adventists, we are historicists. I believe that Daniel 11, verse 40, and the deadly wound of 1798 is the hermeneutical key to the end of Daniel 11, because exegesis of a passage divorced from historical context is eisegesis. And so I see very clearly the deadly wound of the papacy in verse 40 of Daniel 11, and this is a key hermeneutical principle. Revelation chapter 11 describes this beast coming out of the bottomless pit. In Revelation 11, verse 7, the interesting thing about this beast, as opposed to the beasts of Revelation 13, is that it's not described. But Revelation 11, verse 8, describing this power, which we understand to be revolutionary France, is described spiritually as Sodom and Egypt. So now we have, from the very text itself in the book of Revelation, license to identify the power at the end of the 1260 years that attacks the papacy as spiritually Sodom and Egypt, Sodom for its licentiousness and Egypt for its atheism. Ellen White affirms this in Great Controversy 269 when Pharaoh says, of Egypt, "Who is Jehovah, that I should obey him?" After France, the King of the South continues as an atheistic power. that then spreads to the Communist Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and China. In 1844, Karl Marx writes the Communist Manifesto from Paris, France. That gave rise to the Russian Revolution. Now, we see that the King of the North is going to make a comeback against the King of the South. Pastor Swearingen already talked about how we see this in the last half of verse 40, but we see that he comes against the King of the South with chariots, horsemen, and many ships. The chariots and horsemen are describing a military power. Now, here's the interesting thing. Remember, there's a pattern that Ellen White says we can follow. There's arms standing on the part of the King of the North in Daniel 11:31. Now we see the King of the North coming back against the King of the South with chariots, horsemen, and many ships. So I see a pattern repeating. Now, I might quickly add, I'm going to talk briefly about the role that Ronald Reagan and John Paul II had in bringing the United States and the papacy together to go against the Communist Soviet Union. You can see the statements on the slides about how this was one of the great secret alliances of all time. It's chronicled in Time magazine, February 24, 1992. However, I don't believe that the fall of the Berlin Wall is a complete fulfillment of the last half of verse 40. I believe that sets the stage for the papacy to have military superpowers backing it up so that it can now enforce dogma. So the King of the South will ultimately be conquered through a Sunday law, which will bring it into alliance with the papacy. So we have military power. Then we see the next thing that would take place is a church-state union being formed. So that would be the abomination of desolation. Then we're going to see the persecution of the saints. So how does this play out? Abomination of desolation. The glorious land was literal Judea, the territory of God's people, through the first 30 verses or the 29 verses, part of verse 30 in Daniel 11. But the very book of Daniel itself tells us that there was a probationary time for the people dwelling in the land of Judea. The Jews had 70 weeks determined for them, and when they rejected Christ, by 34 AD, they are no longer the chosen people of God, and the execution of that close of probation takes place in 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem. So when we move forward in our interpretation of Daniel chapter 11, I'm not looking to the Middle East to try to figure out when Jesus is going to come back, because Daniel 10:14 tells us that this prophecy is about what will befall God's people in the latter days, for the vision is yet for many days. So I'm looking not to literal Israel or to the Middle East. I'm looking to the people of God. Galatians 3:29 tells us that if you are Christ, you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So my belief about the glorious land is that this is spiritual Israel. The churches that are not part of the Roman Catholic Church, this would include Worldwide Adventism and the Protestant churches, who make a profession of following Christ. And when the King of the North enters into the glorious land, whenever the King of the North entered into a territory, or the King of the South entered into the territory throughout the prophecy, it wasn't for the purpose of passing through, it was for the purpose of conquest. So I see the King of the North entering into the glorious land as the abomination of desolation, union of church and state, and again history repeats. So this pattern of Ellen White saying that scenes similar to those described in these words, 30 to 36, is playing out in 40 to 45. Now, briefly, before I mention the tidings out of the east and the north, when you look at the text, you see he'll stretch forth his... I'm not going to say much about Edom, Moab, and Ammon, but in verse 42 it says, he stretches forth his hand upon the countries. The land of Egypt shall not escape. I believe that's the remaining territory of the atheistic nations of the world. When a Sunday law crisis takes place, Revelation 13 says that fire is going to come down from heaven on the earth and the side of men. There's not going to be an atheist left. They will be conquered by supernatural miracles. Verse 43, having power over the treasures of gold and of silver, that relates to economic control through Sunday laws. The Libyans and the Ethiopians being at his steps. The Libyans and the Ethiopians were the last line of defense for Marc Antony and Cleopatra, the last king of the south in 31 BC. And I see geopolitically that Islam has aligned with the communistic, atheistic nations of the world against the West. So that's a tentative idea I have about Libya and Ethiopia. But we get to verse 44, it says, tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. I believe this is the loud cry message, the sealing message that goes forth with great power, just when it seems like the papacy is going to conquer the whole world. And in the Hebrew mind, if you've come down through the territory from the north, through the glorious land, into Egypt, and the Libyans and Ethiopians that are at your steps, you've conquered the whole world. So the papacy papacy thinks it's conquered the whole world, and then the loud cry message comes back and identifies that Babylon the Great has fallen, has become the habitation of devils. So this leads to a response of great fury, where he goes forth to destroy and utterly to make away many, and that correlates with Revelation 12:17. Now, that correlates with the persecution of the saints when he goes forth to destroy and utterly to make away many. And the language in that verse actually is suggestive potentially of a death decree. This then leads to the planning of the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. The tabernacle is a place of worship. A palace is a political center of authority. So you have this final union of church and state where the glorious holy mountain is being surrounded by the king of the north, and the sea represents the people of this world. So briefly, the glorious holy mountain, Daniel 9:16 identifies Jerusalem as the holy mountain. Psalms 48 verses 1 and 2 says Mount Zion is the holy mountain. Joel 2:32 has this interesting verse that says, "It shall come to pass that whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be delivered. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem shall be deliverance, as the Lord hath said, and in the remnant whom the Lord shall call." I see this synonymous nature of Mount Zion, Jerusalem, and the remnant at the end of the world. And the very verse before in Joel 2:31 is describing the great dark day that connects to the sixth seal of Revelation 6. So it's end-time language. The word for delivered in Joel 2:32 is the same Hebrew word as delivered when Michael stands up to deliver his people for everyone whose name is found written in the book. The glorious holy mountain is symbolic of the remnant who survived the shaking. These are the 144,000 who will eventually stand on Mount Zion with the Lamb, and are those that Michael stands to deliver. Now, interestingly, Review and Herald, November 1908 says, "Wonderful events are soon to open before the world. The end of all things is at hand. The time of trouble is about to come upon the people of God. Then it is that the decree will go forth, forbidding those who keep the Sabbath of the Lord to buy or sell, and threatening them with punishment and even death if they do not observe the first day of the week as the Sabbath." Now, notice the very next thing that she says. So there's going to be this death decree. The very next thing she says is, "And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people." That's why, friends, I don't see the tabernacles of the palace and the glorious holy mountain as being a Middle East regional conflict. It's a conflict over the people of God. Now, I'm going to fly really fast here, but when Michael stands up, he's standing up from finishing the work that he was doing while he was seated at the right hand of God. And in Hebrews 8:1 and 2, he is seated at the right hand of God as our high priest, as the mediator of a better covenant, working to write his law into our hearts and minds. That's what those verses say. When Christ finishes this work while he is seated, he will have a commandment-keeping people. Not only is he the high priest seated at the right hand of God, he's also the author and finisher of our faith in Hebrews 12:1 and 2. When he stands up, he will have a group of people who will run with patience. They will exercise faith. And so when he stands up, he will have a group of people who keep the commandments of God, have the patience of the saints and the faith of Jesus. As I conclude, I want you to consider this. When you look at the big picture of Daniel, Daniel 2 shows that Jesus is coming back. But Daniel 7 shows that in order for Jesus to come back, there must be a judgment first. But Daniel 8 tells us in order for the judgment in heaven to finish, the sanctuary in heaven must be cleansed. Daniel 11 then tells us when the sanctuary in heaven is cleansed, Michael stands up and probation closes. So when I look at verses 40 to 45 and the king of the north entering into the glorious land, this describes the final struggle where Satan is trying to overthrow God's people through the papacy, who is the king of the north, to wipe them off the map. And yet there will be a group of people, of faithful people found in Mount Zion, who keep the commandments of God, have the patience of the saints and the faith of Jesus, who Michael stands up for. And when Michael stands up, he has won his final battle against Satan in the great controversy, and he can declare to the world, "I have my people, probation is closed, and I'm coming to take them home." Thank you very much.
Amen. Okay, very, very good presentations. We're going to take a 5-minute break. We are not responding to these. There will be other opportunities. You can see them on the break if you'd like. 5 minutes, we'll come back and do the Islam view, so you don't want to miss that either. 5-minute break, we'll start at 4:10.